We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma ad semper Virgo Felix te porta.
Welcome everybody, stay with us Fidelity, coming at you once again with Dr. Alan Fimister, and we're going to be talking about the Council of Constance. I think I said that right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, you should probably pronounce it in Swiss German or something, or Bavarian. I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. That's what I was going with. Like, what would it be?
So this is the 16th Ecumenical Council, contrary to the dodgy numbering that I gave at the beginning of last time when I was trying to work out in my head at short notice. So this one
3, 4.
is the 16th. And it's a biggie. In fact, I mean, it's of all the councils, it's the one that's most like Vatican II. Do with that what you want, but it's. I mean, in the sense that it's like a big event council, and it kind of arises out of a lot of big problems, but turns them into a lot of other big problems rather than solving them.
Back to the pile.
Yeah. So to understand it, so it runs from 1414 to 1418. It was summoned in 1413, met in 1414, and finally dissolved in 1418. It had 46 sessions, which is massive. Although, well, yeah, I should say that when I say it was summoned in 1413 and met in 1414, that's summoned for reasons that we'll get to. And a lot of those sessions are also sessions. So yeah, it's complicated. But the background is that the 14th century that preceded it was, which intervenes between Vienne and Constance, was a complete disaster from almost every imaginable point of view. So now let's see what order to deal with the disasters in. Well, I mean, if we remember that Vienne, it's the big sort of headline from Vienne is the dissolution of the Templars, and that is already flagging up two massive problems. One is that the Holy See's attempt to govern Christendom as if the Pope was kind of also the Emperor, and that there wasn't any need for the Emperor, has already it hasn't worked out very nicely, and has in fact unleashed the powers of the national monarchies, and that they're much more of a problem than they had previously been, and people's preoccupation is much more with the interests of these national monarchies, and the Crusades are completely neglected. And so the ability of the Holy See to project force on its own behalf, which the most extravagant and far-reaching expression of that was the military religious orders, has faltered, and in the case of the Templars, collapsed. And the other problem is on the strictly hierarchical side is the Holy See's ability to govern the whole Church in a sort of imperial fashion, rather than just being a sort of emergency court of appeal and supervising patriarchal authority for the West, as it had more been in the first millennium. Its attempt to just run everything has also kind of blown up in its face a bit. And we talked about how Giles of Rome said that wrote this book about how this is the problem with exempt religious orders. Even though he was the head of an exempt religious order, he was saying the Holy See just can't maintain proper supervision of these organizations. And okay, we don't know, I mean, Giles of Rome doesn't say this, we don't know whether or not the Templars were innocent or guilty, and probably they were innocent, but the council was forced to dissolve them by a powerful national monarchy, so that's kicking back to the first problem, and had to say basically we don't know whether they're innocent or guilty, but it's now such a mess that we're going to have to dissolve them anyway. I mean, that is not a desirable situation at all. So there's all sorts of, you can see in Vienne, and of course the fact the Pope's in France and isn't leaving anytime soon, you can see in Vienne the seeds of all these problems already building up. Now, the religious orders also provide a problem in themselves, because whereas there used to just be different strata of Christian society, widows and monks and hermits and knights and all this kind of stuff, now in the last few centuries before Vienne, the idea of a religious order as a special international organization exempt from civil and local ecclesiastical law, with massive property and a centralized administration and all this kind of stuff has built up. And not only are these organizations difficult to supervise properly, but they're also intensely competitive with each other. And this is undermining the intellectual life of the church, because they all have their own favorite theologians and they're all cheering for their guy, and that's completely kind of complicating and poisoning discussions about theology. And one of the big problems that emerges in the 14th century over this is kind of tied up a little bit to Franciscan poverty, which is that the ideal of poverty that St. Francis propounded was really radical, and real dependence on divine providence, worried about where you were going to live, how you're going to eat from one day to the next, or rather not worried because you trust in divine providence. That's the whole point. But the Franciscans, even in St. Francis's lifetime, are not really living up to this. Well, it's a kind of self-destroying ideal in a way, because it's so authentic and evangelical and popular with the faithful who are fed up with corrupt clerics and religious, that they pour money at the Franciscans. And they've always had this problem. They're to this day, I believe, the richest order in the church. So the Dominican friend of mine said, the Franciscans will fly in from anywhere on earth at a moment's notice to tell you about their poverty, which is very, very nasty. But the kind of chief alibi for the Franciscans not really following the charism of their founder is kind of, well, we need to do a lot of academic stuff. And I was reading this book a few years ago written by some conventual Franciscans, or at least in the conventual tradition, and it was sort of arguing that when, St. Francis had that vision of the cross of St. San Damiano, rebuild my church, which you see is falling down. Mm-hmm. And of course he took it literally, and no doubt God intended him to take it literally, but God also intended him to take it figuratively. That is, by your inspiring example and the lives of your faithful brethren, help to save the church from disaster at this difficult moment. But this text, which I was reading, was interpreting his inspiration to go and tend to lepers as also, as literal, as figurative and not literal. So that the lepers were actually heretics and other people in intellectual error, and really the Franciscans were founded in order to be academics and deal with people who were in error in universities and stuff. And I'm thinking, I'm sure there was another order founded at the same time that was supposed to be doing that. What were they called again? So the chief alibi for not really following the charism of St. Francis is the kind of Franciscan intellectual tradition, which St. Francis was very nervous about, because books are very valuable. He wanted, impoverished, simple fellows going around preaching penance, not people, writing volumes and volumes of stuff about their theories about spiritual matter and whether or not Christ would become incarnate even if man hadn't fallen, and all this kind of stuff. And because the Dominicans are kind of already set up to do that, they're supposed to be mendicant friars with radical poverty, but mitigated by the necessities of intellectual life, because they have to be able to deal with heretics. So for the Franciscans to have exactly the same thing means that there's this permanent, they have to kind of say the Dominicans aren't doing their job properly all the time, because otherwise the question of why the Franciscans are doing their job for them might be raised. And so So between the Dominicans and Franciscans, you get this particularly intense build up of the football team spirit of coming up with theological positions, because they're not the theological position of the other lot. And this now, Benedict XVI famously in his Regensburg address, when he says that he quotes the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, Paleologos, who was living at this time, as saying that Islam had brought nothing but violence into the world, and lots of Mohammedans started threatening and blowing things up until we admitted that they weren't violent. But if you remember that incident, but in that famous speech, he says that this problem is, well, he doesn't talk about the specific problem I just described, but he traces a parallel movement to the problem with Islam in Western thought to Scotus, and Scotus's voluntarism. Now the Scotists get very upset about that, and they don't like it, and they're annoyed about him saying that in that talk. And I'll leave them to defend their master. But after Scotus came William of Ockham, and he
you hit Darth right the first time.
So he took this voluntarism thing to a level beyond, and particularly this position on philosophy called nominalism, where you deny the real natures of things. And what's kind of going on there is that St. Thomas has kind of synthesized the Western philosophical tradition to such a kind of pitch that if you're kind of on principle going to disagree with him, you start having to unpick not just St. Thomas's specific positions, but also, everything is sound in the perennial philosophy, as the Church calls it, all the way back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And this divides the medieval universities into two warring camps. One's called the Via Antiqua, which holds on to moderate realism, at least moderate realism, the idea that things really do have common natures between things, and then which is really just, and this Via Antiqua, the ancient way, is really the whole tradition of the perennial philosophical tradition going back to Socrates and Anaxagoras and people like that in the very early days of Western philosophy, but then the Via Moderna, which is arguably where the whole term modern comes from, which should warn you, the modern way, because modern previously just meant what's happening at the moment, but it starts to mean a new age in the history of the world, as it were. Novus Ordo Secularum.
Trouble difficulties here. Did you hear that? So the Via Moderna is the camp that rejects the real existence of natures, and that starts to really pull apart the whole of Catholic theology and Western thought, and it's a bit of a nightmare. And Protestantism and modern views about the nature of the state, and the whole of dreadful modern philosophy and all this kind of weirdness about we don't know whether the world exists and stuff. The Matrix movies, and the surgical career of the Wachowski brothers. They all go back to as it were, to the rise of the Via Moderna. Not to throw us on a curveball, I know plenty of guys. I lived with one out in Denver who would say there's no tree, or that tree doesn't exist. I was at work, and the guy wanted to fight me because he said this floor doesn't exist. And I just started stomping around and going, what is that? What do you mean?
Yes, well, that all basically comes back to this intellectual disaster in the 14th century. Because if there's no real natures, then there are no real things. Because what limits one thing from another thing is the fact that this is a different kind of thing to that kind of thing. The fact that there's a glass on top of the table is only true because glass is one thing and the wood of the table is another thing, and one stops there and the other. So once you start saying that
there are no real natures, then there's no real things, and therefore you don't really know anything, and therefore you're trapped inside your head, and all this nonsense. And if there's no real natures, then there's no real answer to what's a good thing or a bad thing, because it doesn't more or less perfectly realize its nature. So that leads to this voluntarism that Pope Benedict was talking about, where things are right and wrong because God feels like saying they're right and wrong that morning. And famously, Occam says that if God commanded you to curse him, that would then become a meritorious act. And of course, there's no human nature. So the basis of political thought, classically in the West, is that man is a social and political animal. He naturally lives in society, and society gets its authority from the author of nature, God. And that, or if there are no natures, then that's impossible. And so that leads into this idea that there's this kind of social contract, which is the origin of civil authority, and once you've signed a contract, all bets are off, and the state can do whatever it likes. So it creates this kind of nightmare, omnipotent state. So pretty much everything bad in the whole of modernity comes from this initial philosophical error. And as I say, modernity itself is in a way just this philosophical error. So that's the kind of right at the beginning of the 14th century. There's this kind of intellectual nightmare develops, and this is followed from 1315 to 1317 by a massive famine. It really is kind of Book of Revelation stuff. So like all the crops are failing everywhere, cattle dying, and then, so it starts. So we've got like wicked error, catastrophic famine. Then in 1337 there begins the 100 Years' War, which actually lasts until 1453, which, is, you will have noticed, is more than 100 years. So that, between France and England. And if you remember, there was this legend that the Master General of the Templars was, when he was burnt at the stake, cursed the Pope and the King of France, and it probably is just a legend applied retrospectively because of the bad things, because the King of France and the Pope both died within the year, but the King of France's dynasty died out as well. Not his kind of meta dynasty, the Capetian dynasty, which is one of the most successful and tenacious dynasties in the history of the world. Goes back to the 10th century and as a royal dynasty. Well, actually to the 9th century as a royal dynasty, and in its earlier form, and then they can trace their way back a lot. And there are still, the King of Spain is a member of that dynasty. But what's called the direct Capetians, the direct descendants of Hugh Capet, who became King of France in 987, they die out in the generation after Philip IV, who we were talking about last time, and that then causes this big dispute as to how the throne of France descends, whether or not it goes to the next nearest relative after the direct male line dies out, or whether or not it goes to the nearest relative in an unbroken male line. And if you say it goes to the nearest relative in the unbroken male line, it goes to the Counts of Valois, and if you say that it goes to just the nearest relative, then it goes to the King of England, and surprise, that causes a war, because the King of England's like, yeah, I'll have France, that's nice. It's the just to give Braveheart a shout out again, despite me thinking that it's a historical travesty. It's the princess in Braveheart, who is totally implausibly supposed to have had a fling with William Wallace, completely impossible. But anyway, she is it's through her that the King of England would be the rightful heir to the French throne. So the son of the weedy, effeminate Prince of Wales in Braveheart is Edward III, who was not weedy or effeminate, and probably not because he was really the son of William Wallace. In fact, definitely not. But anyway, he gains through his mother a claim to the French throne, and so this is what starts the 100 Years' War, which goes on for a very long time, as the name suggests.
They weren't good at math back then.
We're
just rounding this one up.
So then in 1347, the Black Death hits. So we've had famine and war and pestilence. They got the order wrong, but they've got all three of them there. And this is absolutely horrendous. 30 to 60% of the entire population of Europe die. Exactly how many people that is not clear. Estimates range from 25 to 200 million. But I mean, this is absolutely devastating. So you've got this horrendous philosophical error, which is basically the origin of modernity and all its works and pomps. Then you've got a massive famine, a horrendous war, and a hideous pestilence. And meanwhile, the Pope is still a kind of hostage in France, but a very comfortable hostage who doesn't really want to go home. And he's there for basically 70 years.
Was Dr.
Urban
Fauci
V.
around him at this time?
Say again, sorry?
Was Dr. Fauci around him at this time?
Not as far as I know. Urban V, Blessed Urban V, in fact, was persuaded by St. Bridget of Sweden that he really did need to go back to Rome. And he did actually go back to Rome 1367, October, to September 1370. But it was difficult. I mean, you know, quite a lot of interesting stuff happened when he was down there. He received the submission of the Byzantine Emperor, John V Palaeologus, and was attended on by the Holy Roman Emperor. But he didn't stay. There was lots of trouble, and he was talked into going back again. And St. Bridget of Sweden warned him that he would not live long if he had presumed to go back to Avignon, but he didn't listen to her, and he went back to Avignon and dropped dead. Yeah. So that was the I'd mentioned last time. There's a brief sojourn back in Rome. That's the brief sojourn back in Rome, and then so it's left to Saint Catherine of Siena to try and persuade his successor Gregory XI that he absolutely has to go back to Rome. Now, while this is going on, I mean, Rome is in a state of chaos. Of course, the papacy's running very nicely. There's a lot fewer riots and kind of scary trouble with scary Italians in Avignon, which is why they like it so much, in addition to the fact that they're all French, the popes and cardinals at this point. And, you know, they like the sitting there in the cafes of Avignon, drinking their glass of Burgundy and you know, steak chips. You know, it's lovely here. Beautiful women. Well, they've got that in Italy as well. But anyway, they don't want to go. And but there's this, you know, the house of Christendom is crashing around their ears from these various different calamities at the same time. The prestige of the papacy is in a state of collapse. And this kind of this terrible cultural cringe begins to set in. So you see this thing with the most visibly in the architecture, in the whole line of Western architecture that's developed in this incredible way over the centuries leading up to this period begins to falter, and they start to desperately want to be classical Roman pagans, and they start to build these Renaissance buildings. Renaissance meaning the rebirth of classical paganism, and they start desperately trying to write Latin as if they were first century BC pagans, and they're trying to build buildings as if they were first century BC pagans. And it represents, I don't know if I've said this to you before, but I always say to the seminarians, it's like the moment in the 1950s when people started realizing the British Empire was falling apart, and British pop groups started singing with American accents. Yeah, and there's this kind of moment of total loss of kind of cultural self-confidence. And so in the same way, and they thought they were being all kind of radical and revolutionary and stuff and exciting and new, just like the people in the Renaissance did. But really what they were doing is they were showing that they'd lost their nerve in an absolutely total sense. And it's the same way with the Renaissance. And one of the great Italian poets at the time, Petrarch, who spends time at Avignon, but is trying to persuade the popes to go back to Rome, but he's the first one who starts to be very snobby about classicizing a language and to talk about the period from the end of paganism until his own time as a sort of middle period or dark age. You know, so all this all this stuff of spitting on all the achievements of Christendom really begins during the period of the Avignon papacy. So you can see, the philosophy's falling apart. People are dropping dead in the streets. The popes are, living the life of Riley in an extremely dodgy way, taxing to death the Western Church, and it's this huge bloated court of bureaucrats, and they're hundreds and hundreds of miles from where they're supposed to be. So yeah, things are not good. So anyway, Catherine of Siena persuades Pope Gregory XI to go back to Rome, and he does finally get back to Rome in January 1377. So that's the end of the Avignon papacy, sort of. And then March the following year he dies. And so it looked like, okay, the Pope's gone back to Rome, he's died, he's in Rome, the papacy's back in Rome, we're okay now, we'll try and fix things. That's not what happens. Basically, almost all the cardinals are French. The Italians and the Romans particularly are furious, obviously, that the papacy's been stolen from them all these years, and they're desperate to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so they gather for the conclave at the end of March 1378, and the Romans all gather outside the conclave, and they start to chant rhythmically, "Elect a Roman or die." And so the cardinals probably do feel a little bit pressured, but the cardinals really, really want to go back to France, and but they are really nervous that their actions in kidnapping the papacy may not be smiled upon by the chaps outside, and that might go badly for them. So they decide to elect a guy from outside the College of Cardinals. It's the last time. So the previous Pope, Gregory XI, he's the last French Pope, as we talked about last time. They're like, after this, they never ever do that again. Italians never let it happen again. And the cardinals, after they elect this guy as Pope, who's not a cardinal, they never ever elect a non-cardinal again as Pope. So his name is Bartolomeo Prignano. He's not technically a Roman. He wasn't born in Rome, but he was born in Latium. So he becomes Pope Urban VI, and they completely recognize him as Pope. He's crowned and everything. There's no initial suggestion of any doubt over his legitimacy as Pope. But then the cardinals get a nasty surprise. He was quite a quiet and unassuming fellow before he became Pope, but once he becomes Pope, there's a nice way of seeing it and the not so nice way of seeing it. They're probably both true. The not so nice way of seeing it is that he went nuts. Basically, he was just like, he wasn't expecting to become Pope, and he just goes mad. He's like, I'm not Pope, I can do whatever I want. I was
imagining someone just walking up to me, "Hey, buddy, you just got elected Pope." Huh? What?
It's like, we by our apostolic authority declare and define that AC Milan are the best football team in the entire.
If you got to be Pope, make the best of it.
So that's the one theory, which definitely the cardinals who don't like him, which is pretty much all of them, fix on. The other one is that he's just like, you swines kidnapped the papacy for 70 years. Look at the chaos around you. You're complete scumbags. I don't want to have anything to do with you. Which is probably also true. But very quickly, the cardinals realise that they are out. Like what's Connie? Oh, Godfather keeps coming. Connie Corleone's husband. It's just you're not having anything to do with the family business anymore. that's your punishment. And then they throttle him in his car. But the cardinals are no longer having anything to do with the family business, and the cardinals are not happy about this, and so it's clear that he holds them in utter contempt, and that he may have lost his marbles. And they basically go off to Anini, which is fittingly enough, which is where this problem all began. That's where Philip IV's Yobos beat up Boniface VIII. Only the French cardinals flee to Anini, but that's the vast majority of them, and they start to issue declarations about what a dodgy guy Urban VI is, and how they weren't really free to choose him, and all this kind of stuff. And then they send letters off to the non-French cardinals and say, "Oh, get over here, we're going to elect a new pope." And then they move off to a town called Fondi, and there they elect Clement VII as their rival pope, Robert of Geneva, who is basically a Frenchman. I know Geneva's in Switzerland, but it wasn't in those days. I mean, admittedly, it also wasn't in the Kingdom of France. But anyway, but it's still French-speaking. So Avignon wasn't in the Kingdom of France. But anyway, and Clement VII, so-called, then goes off back to Avignon. So this is what establishes what's called the Great Western Schism. So you then have these two lines of popes, and it's pretty nasty. It would take a very long time to go into and explain. There's a sequence of popes in the two different obediences, as they're called, the obediences meaning the people who follow the two different popes. Different countries, related to their rivalries with each other, line up with different papal claimants. So France, predictably, goes for the Avignon line. England, because of the rivalry with France, goes for the Roman line. Scotland, because of its rivalry with England, goes for the Avignon line. So and so it goes. And of course, they're desperate to get people to back them, so they'll give you anything. So you can get a dispensation for pretty much anything at this period, because the two rival papal lines are desperate to get you on their side. So I remember going to a talk by this Benedictine monk in Oxford, in which he pointed out that I've forgotten which line of popes it was during the Great Western Schism, but one of them had given it might have been more than one, because you could say, well, this guy's offering this, what are you offering? Had given them a dispensation to eat duck on Fridays because it was kind of aquatic, and it might have even been more sweeping. I might have been. That's right. Yeah, they said there are no. That's right. They told him, the monks in Oxford told the Pope, or whichever Pope it was, we're miles from the sea here. Oxford's the furthest place from the sea in England. How can we possibly eat fish on Fridays? You've got to let us eat meat on Fridays. Like, there's two big rivers that flow through Oxford. One very big river that flows through Oxford. But anyway, so they got away with that. And he reckoned it was still in force, this dispensation. But anyway, yes. So then everyone gets scandalised. Both lines of popes are as dreadful as each other, and so they're handing out frivolous dispensations and trying to get money out of people, and everyone's horribly scandalised, and it's even worse than it was when the popes were in Avignon. And so they try to fix the problem in 1409 by holding this council in Pisa. Basically the cardinals, because they keep, whenever one of these popes dies, the cardinals promise each other that if I'm elected pope, they all say, if I'm elected pope, I'll talk to the other guy, we'll have a joint ecumenical council, and we'll sort it all out, and everything will be fine, and we'll abdicate in favour of some agreed third pope who will be the real pope. And as soon as they're elected, they're like, I'm the pope, I can do whatever I want, yes, kiss my ring. Kneel when you say that, kiss my red
I was just
slipper.
thinking of Zod and Superman. Kneel before Zod.
Yeah, exactly, that's right. So it's a nightmare. So eventually the frustrated cardinals and everybody else who's frustrated get together and hold this council in Pisa. Now, this is a problem because it's rejected by both of the two papal lines. So, and this reflects another problem which has been building up over the period, which is conciliarism. So, because the papacy has been a mess for a long time, and now we don't even know who the Pope is, and nobody knows how to solve this because we don't know who the cardinals are, because obviously who the cardinals are depends on who the Pope is. So they need to. So they think, well, we don't know who the Pope is, we don't know who the cardinals are. The Eastern patriarchs are all in schism anyway. There's Latin patriarchs, but they're a bit nominal because we've been kicked out of the Holy Land since the end of the 13th century. So what on earth are we going to do? Well, who's next? Bishops. Okay, so what's the exciting thing you do with bishops? Ecumenical Council. So we're going to have an ecumenical council, but you can't have an ecumenical council unless the Pope convenes it. But we don't know who the Pope is. That's the whole problem. So this error develops, or that councils can be created without the say-so of popes, basically. And this is this error called conciliarism, which is now definitely a heresy because it's incompatible with the solemn definitions of the First Vatican Council. Arguably, it was an error rather than a heresy because its falsity is deduced from divine revelation rather than being directly apparent from divine revelation. But that's a complicated question whether it's an error or heresy before Vatican I. But anyway, it's a heresy now. So conciliarism, they get together this pseudo ecumenical council of Pisa, and the cardinals and the bishops elect a new pope, Pope Alexander V, and he only lives for a few months. So he is succeeded by Pope John the 23rd, not the John the 23rd of
John 23rd the first.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Now, some people claim that it wasn't until John the 23rd, Saint John the 23rd of Vatican II fame, became Pope, that it was definitively established that Rome did not recognize these Pisan popes. So some people claim that the Roman line was the real line, but then the Pope was Pope Gregory XII, who was the Roman Pope at the time, was legitimately deposed by the Council of Pisa and replaced by Alexander V and then John the 23rd, and then the whole thing was rectified by the Council of Constance, which we're going to get to, and that's the line of popes. But other people would say, and it's contrary to what some people will try and tell you, it was not the case that the Pisan popes were generally accepted before John the 23rd of the 20th century, because if you look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, the old one from 1910 or whatever it is, that's on the New Advent site, if you look up those popes, you'll see they're described as anti-popes. So it's not true that those Pisan popes were necessarily accepted. But anyway,
but if you're scoring at home, your scorecard's all over the place, right?
Yes, it's all very confusing. So, and in fact, it's even more confusing because in fact there's a missing Pope John. They got the number of Pope Johns wrong at some point. So in fact there haven't been 23 Pope Johns. So I suppose you could say that the current, if you were a Pisanist, then you could say that John the 23rd of the 1960s was in fact, or the late 1950s, was the 23rd John, because the other John the 23rd was really John the 22nd, and John the 22nd, anyway, forget about it. It's too confusing. But yeah, the Pisan popes are not the real deal. But anyway, but most of Christendom accepts them. So the Avignon popes are left with just Scotland and Aragon continue to recognise them, and the Roman popes are still recognised by the ruler of Naples and I think King of Hungary, if I remember rightly. But most of the rest of Europe is now pro Pisa or is neutral to pro Pisa, and but that would already still provide a problem. Two problems: one, that not all of Christendom is accepting the Pisan popes, and two, that they're not the real popes. Apparently John the 23rd is not great. He's as bad as all the other ones, and he's living the high life and enjoying himself, and just like the other ones, and everyone's frustrated with him. And the Emperor Sigismund, who isn't actually, everyone calls him the Emperor, he is actually the King of the Romans because he's not been crowned by the Pope. But anyway, we'll just call him the Emperor Sigismund because everyone calls him that. So the Emperor Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor-ish elect, he says to like John the 23rd in speech marks, okay, there's these other two, you've got the whip hand now, most people recognise you, go to them, say, right, now let's have an ecumenical council again, and you two will abdicate and I will abdicate and we'll have a compromise candidate, and then that will finally solve it. And they'll cooperate with you because they'll get the best deal. They need to strike a deal now because they've lost most of their support. And John the 23rd is like, no, I'm the Pope. I'm the Pope. I can do what I want. AC Milan, so everyone gets really frustrated with John the 23rd, and eventually, under very, very heavy pressure from the Emperor, he agrees to summon, except it's not really summoned because he's not really the Pope, the Council of Constance. And again, the reason it's in Constance, in German-speaking lands, is because the Emperor Sigismund's fed up, and he doesn't trust the Italians any further than he could throw them, and he wants to hold the council as far away from the influence of. Well, they obviously don't want it in France because that's blown up in everyone's faces, and they don't want it in Italy because they don't trust the Italians, and so basically they want to have it in Germany. That's the reason later on why the Council of Trent is held in Trent, because that's technically part of the Kingdom of Germany, but even though it's Italian speaking. But anyway, Constance is not Italian speaking, it's German speaking, and that's where they hold this council that isn't really an ecumenical council. So John 23rd convenes it now, being somewhat on the back foot. Gregory the 12th, the Roman Pope, who is actually the Pope, he now thinks, okay, perhaps it's time to negotiate. And meanwhile, John the 23rd, as I say, was very reluctant about the whole thing. So John the 23rd is kind of he's like, how do I get out of this? I like being Pope. I don't want to stop being Pope. It's really good. He says, I can't just say I've changed my mind, lads, because they'll go completely mad. And so on the 20th of March 1415, he decides to just run away. Because he thinks, well, if I run away, it won't count as an ecumenical council. I get to keep being Pope, and that'll be great. And so the council obviously is absolutely furious. He does successfully run away. So they start to, and actually, conciliarism. People often think that Constance is just mentally conciliarist right from the start, and certainly there are problems because it's convened by a not a real Pope in the first place, who was himself elected by a self-summoning ecumenical council. But really it's John 23rd running away that really forces them to say the really strongly conciliarist things, because they have to claim to still be a legitimate ecumenical council after the Pope has run away. So they start to issue statements about the fact that they directly receive their authority from God, and that the Pope can't dissolve them without them agreeing, and all this kind of stuff. And so they start saying stuff about the supremacy of councils over popes, and them receiving authority directly from God and not via the papacy. And this is going to cause huge problems for centuries and centuries until Vatican I, because there's a whole kind of school of theology in the church, a conciliarist school of theology that flows into what's later called the Gallicon school of theology, that claims the superiority of councils over popes and denies the genuine universal ordinary jurisdiction of popes. And of course, because they don't want the popes to solemnly define that their doctrine is false, they also want to deny the infallibility of the popes unless the definitions are received by the whole church, which is their way of stopping their position being outflanked by a doctrinal statement by the popes. So, and this is particularly marked in a document called Hex Sancta, which is issued on the 6th of April 1415 by the Council of Constance, or the pseudo Council of Constance, which says that the various of those claims that I've just described. the council itself, both Pisa and Constance, are problematic in the way that they're organised. There's more than 100 bishops there, but there are many more non-bishops who sit as if they were members of the council like anybody else. So you've got abbots who aren't bishops, and you've got other clerics who are, and loads of theologians and canon lawyers sitting there. So partly because parliaments and estates and these various different representative institutions that started to appear, particularly in the 13th century, have been developing rapidly in Europe at the same time. So they're thinking in terms of those sorts of institutions when they put together the Council of Constance. And so they're not, it's more like put together like a kind of parliament of Christendom. And they also they get the people, they get the delegates, or delegates, of course, already a bad sign to call them that, but they get the voting members of the Council of Constance vote and organise in nations instead of in other ecumenical councils where one bishop, one vote. You've got non-bishops in large numbers voting, but they vote in groups based around because the University of Paris, which is the greatest university of Christendom, is itself organised in national groups. The student body is organised in national groups, and there are these four nations, as they're called, of the what are they called? The nations are, write them down. Where are you gone? Your nations? There they are. The Italians, the French, the Germans, and the English. Right. And the English includes the Scots, which I'm sure pleased them, and the Germans includes the Bohemians and stuff like that as well. So they're much bigger than just those areas. Later on, when they try and win round the Spanish bishops to accepting a unified papal candidate, they add the nation of Spain to that. So you end up, by the end of the Council of Constance, you've got the five nations of the West: Italy, France, Germany, England, and Spain. So now that's all completely dodgy. I mean it's totally not legitimate for an ecumenical council to function in that way, and it shows this phenomenon we began talking about at the beginning about how there's this slow development of national identity and national monarchies beginning to supplant the universal authorities of Pope and Emperor and the universal identity of Christendom. So so on the 29th of May 1415 they declare John the 23rd deposed. And this pleases Gregory XII no end, so this is his opportunity, and he decides to kind of cut his losses, and so he agrees on the 4th of July, 1415. His legate appears at the Council of Constance and convenes it as an ecumenical council. So basically, he's ignoring everything that happened beforehand. He's maintaining that he is the only real pope. But he's saying, now you are an ecumenical council. I'm making you an ecumenical council. I'm endowing you with the authority to elect and to determine the manner of the election of my successor. And then, having finished that piece of paper, Gregory XII's legate puts that one down and picks up his second piece of paper, which is his decree of abdication. So Gregory XII abdicates, and so now there is no pope. There is a valid sitting ecumenical council, and it has been endowed by the pope, who's now ceased to be the pope, with the power to elect his successor. Meanwhile, they managed to capture and imprison John the 23rd. So he's sitting gloomily in prison in Constance at this point. So then they're like, okay, now we've got to deal with the Avignon guy. So so the Emperor Sigismund goes off in person, and they send off all kinds of ambassadors, and all the other great monarchies of Christendom are like, okay, give up now. So this is Benedict XIII, and he doesn't give up. So you'll often hear they get really irritated with him, and eventually even Aragon abandons him, and he gets left on this little island, which is the only place off the coast of Spain. It's the only place in the world that recognises him as Pope. And he creates some cardinals to elect his successor, and then that guy creates some cardinals, and they fall out with each other and elect two rival successors. And one of those two rival successors to Benedict XIII, finally submits to the Pope who's elected by the Council of Constance years later, but one of them doesn't, and we don't really know what happened to him. So basically, you'll often hear people falsely, as it were, simplifying the Council of Constance and saying, oh, well, no one could agree who the Pope was, so they all agreed to abdicate in favour of this council, and then the council agreed to elect one successor to them all, and everything was happily ever after. Aren't councils wonderful? You'll often hear people say this. But this is nonsense, right? Because A, the guy who summoned it in the first place, John the 23rd, changed his mind and ran away, was deposed and locked up by the council which he summoned, right? So if he was really the Pope, then the church ceased to exist. B, the Avignon Pope never agreed, and although one of his successors did agree, C, one of them didn't ever, and we don't know what happened to him. So he probably just died without any successor, or perhaps he elected Dan Brown Pope, or you pick. But whatever you want to do, the church ceased to exist in the 14th century unless you accept, the 15th century, unless you accept that that Gregory XII was really the Pope. So in fact, in that sense, Constance politically resolves it, because it shows that the other candidates are just incorrigible and impossible, and gets everybody immensely frustrated, and they all accept what Constance does because there's no alternative. But in terms of the idea that you could be neutral as to who the real popes were before Constance and after the beginning of the Western Schism, it's impossible. The only way the church wasn't destroyed by the Great Western Schism is if the Roman popes were the real popes. So we are. End of rant. So after a long time of fruitlessly trying to persuade Benedict XIII that he should abdicate, they declared Benedict XIII deposed as well. They kind of go through the motions of deposing all of them. Well, the two that didn't abdicate, because they are trying to cover their bets. So they think falsely that, well, I suppose it is a sitting. Well, yeah, but it wouldn't be a sitting legitimate council if Benedict XIII was Pope. But they think falsely that a council that had summoned itself, which is what it would be if Benedict XIII was Pope, can depose Benedict XIII, which wouldn't be true if Benedict XIII was really the Pope. But because all of these conciliarist ideas are floating around, they depose both of them, both John XXIII and Benedict XIII, because they have to make sure that they've, as far as it lies within them, dealt with the problem according to all of the different theories that are floating around as to who the Pope is and what a council can and can't do. So finally, on the 11th of November 1517, sorry, not 1517, I've jumped ahead another century, 1417, they elect Martin V as Pope. And he is, apart from on this little island off the coast of Spain, he is recognised by everybody as the Pope. And the whole wretched thing is brought to an end. And there are then 7 reform decrees put together, which are then promulgated by Martin V. Now, Gregory XII is careful to make clear that nothing that happened before he convened the council counts. And Martin V is also careful he sort of recognises everything since Gregory XII. He uses some kind of ambiguous circumlocutions to avoid offending the different schools of opinion. So he talks about everything that the council has done in a conciliar manner, we recognise. But I mean, that's kind of like everything that should be recognised is recognised, which of course doesn't actually tell you anything. And then he actually confirms different things done by the council at different stages by his papal authority, but without uniformly recognising everything that it did, either before it became a real council or even after it was a real council. So he's very, very careful about what he's doing. So Hex Sancta is never recognised, though there's some attempt to dispute this at the moment. But anyway, we won't go into that. But Hex Sancta is never recognised. There's another decree, however, called Frequens, which, as the name suggests, is about the fact that you've got to have lots of councils. And Frequens, it isn't a doctrinal decree, thankfully, but it's trying to create a kind of quasi-parliamentary situation in the church, whereby basically Martin V has to say where within 5 years there's going to be another council before he dissolves this council. And of course, now that doesn't really bind him because he's the Pope and he can't be bound in disciplinary matters. But of course, they think he can. He doesn't say whether he thinks he can. Of course, he thinks he can't. But he goes along with it because he doesn't want to bring up the issue of whether he can, because he doesn't want people going off and saying that they can bind him. So he thinks, well, if I just go along quietly, the question of whether or not I have to go along quietly doesn't come up. So Frequens says that he has to announce a new council within to meet 5 years later before he dissolves this one, and then before he dissolves the next one he has to announce a council to meet within 7 years, and then every 10 years thereafter. Now eventually that none of that happens. I mean, well, some of it sort of happens, but it doesn't really happen. And the Pope's careful to summon councils in inconvenient places as late as they possibly can, and then nobody turns up, and they say, nobody turned up, what can I do? Let's go home. So obviously they're very worried about this, but they take it very slowly. They don't actually repudiate these conciliarist theories until it's, Constance has, receded several decades into the past. So they're being very careful around the whole thing. He takes the name Martin because the 11th of November is the feast of Saint Martin. But there we are. Now Constance does a number of other things, some of which end up actually being real acts of the council, and some of which don't. So this is Constance in the broad sense. There are two you can see this is, obviously, as we've been talking about all these horrible things in the 14th century, this is the kind of nasty soup out of which Protestantism is going to emerge. And some of the signs of this, two of the most famous signs of this, are these two heretics, John Wycliffe, who's English, and Jan Hus, who's Czech, from Bohemia. And Hus is a great devoted follower of Wycliffe. I mean, not in person. I mean, he reads his writings and is very impressed. Wycliffe is long dead by the time Constance starts. And they have very kind of proto-Protestant ideas about, denying the efficacy of the sacraments of immoral clergy, and denying that there's any source of authority other than the Pope. Other than the Bible in the Church. And with Hus, it's also entangled with the whole nationalism thing, because Bohemia is a kingdom, but it's a kingdom that's inside the Holy Roman Empire, and it's very dominated by German speakers, and of course that's going to be a problem all the way down to the 20th century. It's part of the background to World War II, and the hostility to the enthusiasm for Hus gets entangled with the hostility to the Germanization of the Kingdom of Bohemia among actual Czechs. The Hussites are also very keen on receiving communion under both kinds, and in fact that's one of the things Constance does, is it defines that it can never be illicit to administer communion only under one kind. So I remember I once dwelt in a diocese that shall remain nameless, where the bishop had this is a long time ago, where the bishop had forbidden the administration of communion only under the form of bread at Mass. And so that decree, I didn't have quite the chutzpah to point this out to him in person, but that decree would be null and void on account of the decree of Constance that it can never be illicit to administer only under one kind. So we are.
Now, if you could go back in time, if you could, would that screw up the timeline? Would it be Back to the Future timeline or Avengers timeline?
If I went back in time to tell the bishop that he couldn't do that? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm still trying to get my head around how time travel works in the latest Avengers film. I'm not competent until I've worked with it. So that's another issue it deals with. There's a theologian called Jean Petit who may or may not have taught a dodgy doctrine of tyrannicide, about it being legitimate to kill tyrants in various circumstances, and a doctrine which may or may not have been his doctrine was also condemned by Constance, although for myself, when I read this decree of Constance to condemning tyrannicide, I find it slightly confusing because it's so broadly defined that it seems to say almost nothing. So basically, it condemns the doctrine that you can, at any time, for any reason, anyone can kill a tyrant who they put, or someone who they think is a tyrant. And of course, I mean, that's so broad that nobody would agree with that doctrine. So I'm not really sure how that's. And certainly later on in the 16th century, there's a Dominican lay brother who assassinates King Henry III of France, and a surprising moment in French history, Jacques Clément OP, and the then Pope gives a barnstorming speech about what a great guy he is. For having done this, because Henry III was a bad Catholic, but anyway, yeah. So you go and look for yourself at the tyrannicide document, the paragraph produced by Constance. It seems to me that it's so broad that I don't really understand. I mean, certainly St. Thomas in the De Regno says, don't go around killing tyrants all the time because you'll usually get something worse than you got when you killed a tyrant. But that's more of a prudential.
A little discernment goes in.
Yeah, that's right. Communion under both kinds can't be enforced such as to make communion under one kind illicit. You can't just kill tyrants willy-nilly. Then there's another thing. I don't think there's really a document about this, but one of the issues that comes up at the council is over the Teutonic Knights. Now, the Teutonic Knights were the third largest of the great military religious orders created during the Crusades. Frederick II, you remember him, the dodgy antichristy type who crowned himself in the Holy Sepulchre. Frederick II, he had invited them to come and ethnically cleanse Prussia. I think we talked about this. And they'd taken over that territory as their own territory. And shortly before the Council of Constance, the Lithuanians, who are, as we mentioned when we first talked about the Teutonic Knights, cousins of the Prussians, they belong to the Baltic, the Balts, and they're pagans until very late, like the Prussians. They worship snakes, and I've got various Lithuanian friends, and when we're in our cups, I accuse them of being snake worshipping Balts when I don't agree with them on something. So the Lithuanians decide to convert to Christianity, and Jagiełło, apologies to Lithuanians because I'm pronouncing it the Polish way because I can't remember how to pronounce it the Lithuanian way. Jagiełło, he says basically the Polish royal line has ended in a female, Saint Jadwiga, and Saint Jadwiga is supposed to be marrying a rather dashing Austrian type with smooth manners and a mean waltz, but Jagiełło says to Jadwiga and the greybeards of the Kingdom of Poland, if you marry me instead, I and my people will all convert to Christianity and merge, well, at least join the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the Kingdom of Poland, and you'll become immensely powerful, because at this point, look at Lithuania on the map now, it's very small, but in those days it was huge. So the greybeards of the Kingdom of Poland, whether out of piety for the desiring the salvation of the Lithuanian souls, or because they were salivating at the idea of becoming the largest state in Europe, persuade Princess Jadwiga to marry Jagiełło, and Jagiełło duly becomes a Christian, and lots of Lithuanian souls are duly saved. But this is a real pain for the Teutonic Knights because they're really into this ethnic cleansing business, and the excuse for their ethnic cleansing, conquest and governance of the Baltic coast is that they're getting rid of these nasty snake worshipping pagans. So if the Lithuanians all suddenly become Christians, that's going to ruin things for them, because Lithuania surrounds the eastern flank of the Teutonic Knights state, and on the western and southern sides they've got only Christians, on their frontier, so they won't be able to conquer any more territory. So they decide to kill the Lithuanians before they can be baptized, in another edifying moment for the history of religious orders. So obviously the Poles and the Lithuanians are really annoyed about this, and they defeat them at the Battle of Grunwald, which the Poles are very excited about to this day, and probably the Lithuanians are too. But the Teutonic Knights and the Poles both rush off, and the Lithuanians rush off to the Council of Constance to get them to determine the theological question of whether or not it's okay to invade a country just because it's pagan. So it seems that the consensus view of Constance and of theologians, Catholic theologians ever since, is no, it isn't, and that a ruler has to be doing lots of bad things in natural law, and not just idolatry, although that's also contrary to natural law, in order for him to count as the kind of tyrant that a Christian ruler can invade and conquer. And although there isn't a specific decree of Constance on this question, that's generally becomes accepted, possibly because of the Battle of Grunwald, as the correct answer to the question. And so when the Spanish start colonizing South America at the end of the century, they're very careful to, or most of them are, Cortez anyway, at least according to his friends' accounts of what happened. They kind of like say, you've got to stop invading people's countries and kidnapping their populations and sacrificing them to their gods and eating them, because that's tyranny. That's definitely tyranny on anyone's account of tyranny. And if you don't agree to stop doing that, all bets are off and we can invade you and take over your country. And they're like, what? We don't speak Spanish. And they're like, great, open fire. I mean,
Here's the gatekeeper. One gatekeeper ripped his arms off.
It's probably they were not given a reasonable amount of time to consider the demands of the Spanish, but they at least ticked the box, however nominally, probably on account of this dispute at the Council of Constance. So Wycliffe gets condemned as well. There's a whole list of the errors of Wycliffe. And Hus gets condemned. Now Hus actually comes to the Council of Constance, they give him Sigismund, the Emperor Sigismund, gives him a safe conduct to the Council of Constance. And then when he gets to the Council of Constance, after leaving him to wander around town and send a few postcards home to Bohemia, they arrest him and chuck him in jail. And he said, but I had safe conduct. And they're like, yeah, but you're heretics, so promises to heretics don't count, so shut up, click, bang. So he's thrown in jail, and it's not terribly edifying, really. And then they put him on trial for heresy. He refuses to recant any of his positions, says he'll, just like Luther does later on, he says, I'll only accept it if you prove to me that it's false according to Scripture. And they're like, yeah, whatever, you've made up your own interpretation of Scripture for everything, we're not interested in that. Right? So they put him on trial for heresy, and they burn him at the stake at the Council of Constance. So there we are. Again, prudential decisions of ecumenical councils. If you want to believe that the prudential decisions of ecumenical councils are divinely inspired, as some clergy would like us to believe about the last ecumenical council, then you'll also have to believe that burning Czech theologians at the stake after giving them a safe conduct, as well as ethnically cleansing Albigensians, are all completely legit. But anyway, so goodbye Jan Hus. They put this sort of paper hat on his head with heresiarch written across it, and then they tie him to the stake and put kindling up to his neck around him, and apparently it doesn't burn very well, and some old lady comes along and helpfully gathers some extra twigs to chuck onto the pyre. Act of great piety. Anyway,
let me help you here. You guys aren't doing it right.
So there we are. So that's it all winds up in 1518 after the 46th session. With Martin V trying to be as ambiguous as he can about how much of it he's approving, in the hope of wriggling out of it later on. And that brings to the end the Great Western Schism. And it's very interesting because he's elected on the Feast of St. Martin 100 years prior to the Reformation. So the Reformation is conventionally taken to have broken out on the 31st of October, 1517. and which is just short of, obviously it's 11 days short of 100 years after the election of Martin V. And of course, Martin Luther, whose actions famously trigger the Reformation, was actually called Martin because he was also born on the Vigil in his case. Well, he was, Martin V wasn't born, he was elected, but Martin Luther was born on the Vigil of St. Martin. So there's these kind of eerie sort of, it's almost as if like God seems to occasionally give people 100 years to sort out their ideas and then smites them. And it seems a little bit that this is kind of going on with Constance. You know, the medieval Christendom is given one more century to try and get its act in order, which it singularly doesn't do. And then, boom.
You're not talking about these times, are you?
oh, you mean about yes? Well, yes. I don't know. I don't know if those questions about certain Portuguese apparitions will come up.
What are you talking about?
Yes. So yeah, there's Constance. Now there is, of course, another council in the meantime before the Reformation kicks off, the Council of Florence, which is the sort of last great hurrah of the Middle Ages, and the one of these late medieval councils that really is rather marvelous. But we'll have to get onto that next time.
Till next time. Thank you, Doc.